Awesome. Hello, I'm Tom Booth. I work at uSwitch. I'm here today to talk about some cultural stuff we've learned about how we work with operations, how develop and operation coexist, and I think we've done a pretty good job of it. And we've been through various different ways of doing it, and we've got to something which seems to work. For those that don't know, this is uSwitch, our website. We try and help users fight complexity in markets. So if you want to go out and try and find what the cheapest thing is for you, that's mostly what drives people. Trying to work out what it is quite hard. And companies deliberately make it so, and so we try and help. We try and help, give you a nice, easy way to put stuff in, and then, yeah, good. Skip forward a bit. I know that I am your gatekeeper between pubs, restaurants, your journey home, and I don't, if you want to run away, I thought I'd just add a little, too long, didn't read at the beginning. So my takeaway is you should go away and build a central team that empowers and supports teams. Your operations, that team should care about operations, but they shouldn't own the operations. The team should. Trying to have that kind of functional ownership only ends up in a lot of friction between different teams. So yeah, I'm going to go through our uSwitch ascension of operational excellence. So we've had three different parts of our lives. The first, centralized. So we're going to take a little journey back, about 10 years back. And most people, if you've heard of uSwitch in tech community, probably know about it post its acquisition by Forward. And maybe even think it only started existing then. But it had been going for quite a long time before that. Just before, it was owned by a couple of people before that, but just before it was bought by Forward, it was owned by a big American PLC. It's a healthy company, it was making reasonable revenue. It was doing all right. It had quite a few products, it had probably too many. It basically tried to go and do sort of domination on everything it could, which was probably to the detriment of its overall thing. The biggest problem they had was ownership was centralized all over the place. So this isn't just the difference between operations and development, this is in their program, in their advertising, just everything was functionally owned. And this caused some really interesting conflicts of interest. A nice example, which is one which is outside of operations and development, but I think indicates some of the problems with this, was their advertising team. So they used to sell advertising space on the site, and their goals and their business, their sort of objectives were not aligned. So you had this fun thing of advertising, selling space on the funnel that was taking a user through to changing their energy, buying some insurance or whatever, that British Gas could go and buy an advert to pull them out so that we wouldn't get any revenue from the potential thing. So it was just this massive conflict in one team trying to optimize this funnel for love and money, and another team just sticking a thing at the top which is dragging people away because a really shiny little advert at the top. We love building walls. A lot. It's kind of like uSwitch decided building walls was a great thing. It would make uSwitch better, and we'd do it at the expense of the user, which is really not what we want to do. We don't want to be competing business units. We should all be going towards the same goal. And the friction between these just hurts the trust, and a lack of trust between groups gums up the works, the machinery of business. It means you add process in because people don't trust each other. They feel they need checks and balances to make sure what's going to happen happens in a way that they can be sure that they're happy with. And this is where you get stuff like this. So I know Kmart made a punt that ITIL, at its purest, is trying to help. And I do believe that. And he also mentioned that most people implement it badly. And I think this is a great example of that. I think most certified kind of standards like this, Agile now being one of them too, generally implemented not so great, don't get the true feeling. I asked one of my colleagues to pick a picture that he thought would represent their time with this. You pick this. And I think up there somewhere, you can probably see the change control board up there, that little math-eating people. So it just reeks of sort of like risk, misunderstanding, and mismanagement. There was a lack of trust in what both development and operations were doing by the business, and mainly development, and so they just put layer after layer of stuff in their way to try and make sure they had the assurance that everything was going to be fine. A typical example of this is every 3 weeks we had a deployment, which looked a little bit like that. Not ideal. Every 3 weeks it was a wild ride. You'd have changes that a developer had forgotten about, and they'd go live, and something would break. And inevitably, operations would get the blame for this. So they would be the business' first port of call. When new releases went live, stuff went wrong, they would go and get yelled at. And they'd have to suck up all of this blame for something that really wasn't their fault. And that misplaced blame just sort of grows these walls even higher between, only feeds that want for process, which is something which I think we can fairly all agree just gets in the way a lot of the time. So then, in about 2010, Forward, which is Internet Company, made a lot of money out of PPC and the such, saw uSwitch. They thought it was an interesting business. They thought it wasn't making as much money as it could be. They did their due diligence. Software sounded okay, had lots of tests. It's all .NET SQL Server, but it all sounded like their development practices were quite reasonable. So they went ahead and they bought it. They started asking these kind of questions when they came in and was working. They were working I was chatting to one chap who was there from the get-go with Forward, and he was working on a project, and just not quite daily, but they would just be pushing code into their sort of integration environment, and something random would break, which would mean they would lose time trying to investigate it, but not only they were investigating it, other people would investigate it. The cumulative time of all those changes and all those breakages was huge. All the services were just one big ball of mud. The company had this want for contraction and inflation of services. They were like, right, everything's going to be a platform. We're going to run everything we can compare through this one system. And then it's like, oh, no, wait, that's a horrible idea. Let's break it out again, and we'll have different systems for all. And through many of these sort of contractions and expansions, it just turned into sort of software hell, which meant understanding what was going on, how you would make any changes was just too hard. Tools provided were also very poor. They had a few boxes in a colo. It was all Windows. Windows back then, I mean, it's getting better at its story for operating now, but was really not very good. And any tooling they did have was not accessible to development. It was strictly in ops camp, and so there was none of this cohesion. So I'm going to sum up some of the problems that we've had. So when we were centralized, getting features to our users was slow. Because of every 3 weeks, it took a long time to get things out to them. We couldn't, improving conversion or something would be a months-long thing, whereas it could have been weeks. Change is complex. The poor design of the system, the poor design process, the poor design of the infrastructure meant that making any change in production was just a nightmare. And lastly, which I think is most important, the functional ownership inside of the company caused serious friction. So that was both, as I mentioned, as in misalignment between different goals, but also that misattribution of blame, which caused not great relationships between ops and development. So we're out of the kind of first step into the second. We've gone decentralized. We decided that we'd have a go at a new world. With the Forward acquisition, we had a lot of power to make change. And so the first thing we did was we thought we'd pick one team, one area that we have, and we'd try doing something we thought was great. Picking one area is always sensible. Trialing your thing, seeing how it works inside the organization, learning, and then having a set of people, if it works, who can then spread that out, is really handy. So the first need that we picked to build a team around was, as a user, I want to reduce my energy bill, which is one, like energy is probably the thing uSwitch is most known for, and that's partly because of this start that it had. So at the core of this was this idea, one team needs to own the whole service. So that's everything. That's operations, that's development, that also includes the sort of business operations, advertising, although that was sort of done away with business, like business partnerships and such. But I make the distinction between product and services. Like, we don't build this. Every release, we don't add a new blade to our razor. I think our stuff looks a little bit, or the way I think of services is a little bit more like this, something that's alive. Something that's together, a whole bunch of parts of machinery working together, living in an environment and responding to that environment, which means you have to embrace change. So one of the first things, deploying continuously. Obvious. Gets out, reduces risks, better for users, helped us work on our funnel a lot. Like, the funnel for us is the most important thing. Getting people through, making sure that they're not getting blocked anywhere, getting them through to switching is key. Another tenet, a team should be in control of its own infrastructure and its architecture. So previously, that was like devolved half-half between the operations team and the development team. And even then, it wasn't like one development team task. There were some architects as well. You had it. And it's like the team who's in charge of helping a user change their energy bill should be in control of all of the software and the hardware that goes into making that service. That is key. Under these conditions, our energy service thrived. It grew and grew. So we thought, we have to go all in with this. We've demonstrated that it's something sensible for us to do, so we have to go all in. And we were lucky, again, because of the sort of the format we had. We were a private company, wholly owned by Forward, and we thought like we were able to be quite brutal with how we ran this organizational change through. So previously, there was QA and centralized ops and centralized program, and they were all just deleted from our system. Some chose to stay, and they moved into the various teams, and some are still around. And we saw this. We saw growth, loads of growth. We went, I can't remember how many times we've multiplied the revenue that we're making then by now, but there was quite quick initial growth. But as mentioned, a fact, Dunbar, as we got bigger, communication got harder. Suddenly trying to have all these teams working together got tricky, because there was not just energy then, there was like insurance and communications, so broadband and comms, broadband and mobiles. And every team had their own idea of where they were going. And not very much was shared in between. Most of what was shared was probably what was trending on Hacker News that day that was pulling them in whatever direction they might go. And that ended up with this, which is hard to grapple with sometimes. So there were these sort of 4 verticals who were all trying to solve very similar problems, often in nigh on exactly the same way, but they all had their own implementations, which not so good. And all of their implementations were useful and built explicitly for them. There was no need for them to ever push their solution to be more useful to the rest of the business. There just wasn't that driver there. And as it grew, the requirement on knowledge of how to use the software that we were using grew deeper. And we had some issues with Mongo that one team battled for a couple of weeks with, which was not fun for them, and not even more not fun when they turned out after a pub trip that one of the other teams had already solved this problem. And just the coordination between the teams is hard. There was so much benefit from isolating them around a single sort of user need and driving them towards achieving that. But at the same time, sometimes that let go of some of the business needs. As I said, we should be focusing on the user. When we're spending time building the same solution over and over again, that's time we're not spending making a better solution for the user. And that is key. They are what makes us the business we are. We should be making sure we are serving them. So if I'm going to go and recap on the problems I outlined in the first one and just see if we can sort of tick them off. So getting our users was slow. Well, I think we've solved that. We've got continuous deployment now. We're rolling out. We're doing, I don't know, how many does my team do? We do 10, 20 deploys a day. Change is complex because of poor architecture. To be honest, we ripped it up. We started again. Your team owns your architecture. It's probably still a bit poop in places, but at least it's your fault, and you can change that. And lastly, the functional ownership fixed. Having all the different kinds of people working on the same project together just meant that we no longer had those barriers between them. They were all working together and working really well. But we have some new problems. Same problems being solved repeatedly. That's just waste. Waste, waste, waste. We don't want to be doing that. Developers are very expensive, and that's a lot of money and a lot of wasted time not delivering things for the user. No one has the complete picture. So we have these 4 sets of people, all who know what it is their group's doing, but none of them know, like no one really knows, like has an overarching view of what everyone is doing. And trying to assemble that at any point in time is quite tricky. And lastly, to reiterate, we're not focusing on our users, and they are our business. So we enter our last phase, our current phase, the one we've been going at for about a year. We've still got a lot to learn, but we've made good strides into it, and it's paying off for us. Key tenet of our re-centralization is retaining control in the service teams. So unlike before, where we had a central team who owned operations, the teams still own and operate their own software. We just want to help them do it. We want to optimize for the common case. We build web services. Building a web service for us should be easy. It should be as easy as just typing in like uSwitch init or whatever, and you have a web service ready to go, deployment, CD, metrics, just all the sort of common tooling that we want. Because we've learned a lot about it over time. Our CTO, Mike, that's Mike Jones rather than Mike Platemore, likes to use this sort of bastardization of a Boston matrix, and I have to say I am a fan of any graph without any axes or numbers or anything on it. Up there in the top right would be something like Amazon, and down in the left would be something like your side project that you haven't had enough time to work on. Energy, which is our blue one, is our most mature product, and it's pretty battle-hardened. We've learned a lot about how to build good web services through that. And we have some products that are not quite as mature, not as in the market as they should be. But we should be using the stuff we've learned out of that team to feed other teams so that they can sort of jump straight to a point further along product maturity, how we wish it could be market penetration as well, a lot easier. Because, yeah, we're all here for the same goal. So we need to help each other, rather than sort of hoard our knowledge inside of the teams. We don't want to stop letting teams experiment, though. We don't want to give them tools and say, you have to be using this. They still need to be able to have the flexibility to try new solutions. As I think Sarah mentioned earlier about the architectural board sort of encouraging the use of Kafka when maybe a different queue would be better. We've had exactly the same problem. But we've been encouraged to use Kafka, but then that doesn't fit our solution, so we've just got to use another one. And we need to have that flexibility because technology changes. And we have a kind of survival of the fittest for our infrastructure. Like teams will try out new things, and maybe they'll gain traction inside of there. Maybe they'll convince another team that they should use it too. And we get this kind of a few people. So say we had one with a new CI system recently and drone won out overall, but we had a couple of people trying, and eventually one sort of surfaced and has now dominated. And it's this central team's job to try and make those tools even more useful. And so it's got traction. How can we make sure that there's less friction to using the common? You want to make sure that your tools that you want to be used are used because they are really good and because they are better than the alternative of someone just spinning up their own new one to replace it. They also need to be easy to understand. And if this that requires us writing a lot of our own documentation, then we will have to. You don't want a team producing software that's like a black box. We had a problem where we had some traction on Sensu, and then someone decided they'd go and whack it in a Docker swarm for everyone to use, except no one else was using Docker swarm. Didn't tell anyone where it lived, and it was just this little island of magic that lived over there. And that's not, when you're trying to have trust with this team, creating something that's just a black box that's like, oh, no, don't worry about that. We've got that, is not so great. Like, as developers, developers seem to want to be able to understand the tools that they're using. And so taking that away from them is not useful, and will just, as they have the flexibility, will just mean that new ones surge upwards. Also, relating to the problem from previously of not having a visibility over our estate, use tools to have a central picture of the entire infrastructure. So we've adopted Terraform, we've written a little DSL around it, and we're currently trying to get all of our AWS inventory into it. It's nice that they've now got the import stuff, and yeah, that's been very handy. Once you have this, you can do a lot with that. A lot of useful things around auditing, checking security groups and such. Outside impressions matter, and this is somewhat related to that. We're now back past with PLC. Our audits have got harder. We have investors, we have owners that want to understand what it is that we're doing. And at the moment, they kind of walk in and they're a little bit like that. Our model of working, when it was in a decentralized, was termed nicely developer anarchy. And I think sometimes for people who are used to something that looks a little bit like our first step in our lovely ITIL world in our centralized mode, find it quite difficult to compute. So being able to sort of use tooling to help people understand our services and understand how they work is great. So it's key that we work together. So this central team will go and sit with and help the teams that are delivering to users. They'll work together on architecture, because that's key, that a new team doesn't start and make some basic mistakes that are going to hurt them in the long term. They'll work together on issues as they come up, say like the Mongo I mentioned earlier. It would be nice that there was a person that could have just dropped by and be like, yeah, we've seen your Slack, we're there to help. And lastly, work together on the bugs in production at 3 a.m. Even though they're not a part of the teams that are running this piece of software, being there for them just encourages a level of trust between them that I think is hard to get any other way. So just to recap again, when we were centralized, getting features flow to our users, we haven't particularly affected that, still good. Changes complex because of poor architecture, still owned, still good. When we were centralized, functional ownership caused serious friction, still don't have that. Trying to keep the friction away, trying to make sure the relationship between this team and others is healthy, that it doesn't suffer the problems that generate the lack of trust that the old model did. And decentralized, problems repeatedly, being solved repeatedly. I think hopefully we've had a good punt at trying to solve that. Having a team whose job is to coordinate the work going on in different and try and share the tooling that's emerging from there and the software that's being used emerging from those teams, and make it even better for our uses so that other teams can adopt it. That's dragging it from the sort of local team maximum up to the global maximum for our business. The problem, no one had a complete picture. Another one that's solved. Our use of Terraform, as well as Puppet and others, has really helped with us having a very easy to, sometimes literally parse image of our infrastructure and the services running on it is great. And we weren't focusing as much on the users. Again, not having to worry about a bunch of the infrastructure problems you didn't before, because common patterns set up by other teams exist. And we've optimized for the common case, so getting your initial web services out is just a dream now. So yeah, go and do this. Build a central team that's job is to empower and support others, not to block them. Obligatory, we're hiring. Thank you very much.